In public session, I want to welcome the Minister and your officials. We're dealing with the double taxation agreement and protocol with the Netherlands and a protocol to the island Switzerland double taxation convention. I also understand that we'll be dealing with some credit union matter, if that's okay, Minister. So we'll proceed to your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman, and I'm pleased to be here today to bring two draft government orders before the committee giving force of law in Ireland to a new replacement double taxation agreement with the Netherlands and a new protocol to the existing double taxation agreement with Switzerland. The new double taxation agreement with the Netherlands was signed by Minister of State Patrick O'Donovan on behalf of Ireland and Foreign Minister Stef Blok on behalf of the Netherlands on the 13th of June as part of the state visit to Ireland of Their Majesties the King and Queen of the Netherlands. The protocol to the double taxation agreement with Switzerland was also signed on the 13th of June by Minister of State Michael Darcy and the Swiss Ambassador to Ireland. As the committee will be aware, arising from the OECD BEPS process, Ireland last year ratified the multilateral convention to implement tax treaty-related measures to prevent BEPS. The convention was discussed at this committee and in the Dáil and was included in Finance Act 2018. The BEPS multilateral convention updates the majority of Ireland's existing double taxation agreements. However, as was indicated to the committee last year, our existing double tax agreements with the Netherlands and Switzerland were not updated by the convention, but will instead be updated bilaterally to reflect the BEPS changes. This is what these two agreements before the committee now seek to do. We also indicated last year that the double taxation agreement with Germany will also be updated bilaterally in due course. Discussions are at an advanced stage with Germany in that regard. As for those partner jurisdictions that have not signed the BEPS multilateral convention, Ireland has written to them to discuss options for implementing the BEPS recommendations. We are committed to ensuring that all of our double taxation agreements meet the standards agreed in the BEPS process. A common feature of both the agreement with the Netherlands and the protocol with Switzerland is the incorporation of strong tools for tackling tax treaty abuse and anti-avoidance measures. Both contain the standards committed to during the OECD BEPS project, as well as a number of measures which I recommend the best practice under BEPS, as agreed bilaterally. The effectiveness of the anti-avoidance tools contained in the BEPS multilateral convention has already been demonstrated with the shutting down of the so-called single malt structure. The Maltese and Irish tax authorities signed a competent authority agreement at the end of 2018 that will achieve this by outlining the common understanding of both tax authorities as to how the changes introduced by the Convention to the Ireland-Malta double taxation agreement will impact this structure. Ireland first signed a double taxation agreement with the Kingdom of the Netherlands in the 11th of February 1969. It's one of our oldest agreements, and over the last 9 years, Irish and Dutch authorities have been discussing replacing the existing agreement. In February 2017, discussions were held in Dublin to agree on how best to incorporate the BEPS-related measures into the replacement agreement as agreed bilaterally between the two countries. The negotiations were successfully concluded. That is what is in front of the committee this afternoon. The new double taxation agreement with the Netherlands performs two primary functions. First, as the original DTA was agreed in 1969, 15 years ago, the new agreement, which is based on the OECD Model Tax Convention, modernises the double taxation relationship between Ireland and the Netherlands. Second, the replacement agreement contains a number of provisions to deal with BEPS, which makes the new agreement fully compliant with the standards under the BEPS project. The primary changes in this agreement are therefore of an anti-avoidance nature. In particular, the new agreement includes a principal purposes test as agreed under BEPS Action 6. This test ensures that any benefits under the double taxation agreement are denied if one of the main purposes of any arrangement is the avoidance of tax. Similar to the agreement with the Netherlands, the purpose of the Ireland-Switzerland Protocol before the Committee today is primarily to update the existing Ireland-Switzerland double taxation agreement to incorporate on a bilateral basis BEPS-related measures. We signed an agreement with the Swiss Confederation on the 8th of November 1966. They were updated in two subsequent protocols in 1980 and 2012. Due to procedural and legal issues in Switzerland which prevented them modifying their double taxation agreements through the BEPS Multilateral Convention, it was agreed that the BEPS measures contained in the Convention would be introduced bilaterally. This protocol contains the standards to combat treaty abuse and improve dispute resolution. The protocol also provides for arbitration when the two treaty partners are unable to reach a solution. As with the double taxation agreement with the Netherlands, the principal purposes test is incorporated into this agreement. In effect, the protocol changes the double taxation agreement in the same manner as if the agreement had been modified by the Multilateral Convention. Our DTA network is an important aspect of our competitiveness in attracting investment. In addition, they are a cornerstone of our trade policy and stimulate trade and investment flows between countries. They provide greater predictability and fairness for taxpayers regarding their tax obligations, and they're key to the prevention of double taxation. The benefits of double taxation agreements are well known, but concerns have been expressed that treaties may inadvertently facilitate aggressive tax planning. This concern was central to the BEPS project and to the BEPS Multilateral Convention. Updating our existing double taxation agreements, whether via the Multilateral Convention or bilaterally, helps to ensure they cannot be used for aggressive tax planning, and as has been shown in respect of the competent authority agreement with Malta, the Revenue Commissioner will use these new provisions where appropriate to prevent aggressive tax planning. Ireland has been a strong supporter of the OECD BEPS process since inception and continues to engage positively at both EU and OECD level. Proactively updating our double taxation agreements are a key example of that work. If the Dáil approves the making of these orders by government, I'll include the orders in the Taxes Consolidation Act of 1997 by way of an amendment in the approaching Finance Bill. This will enable us to complete the necessary notifications to finalise the ratifications of both agreements. I commend these draft orders to the Committee and, of course, Chairman, I'm happy to take any questions from you or your colleagues.
McGrath.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to welcome the Minister and his officials, and thank you for the opening statement. I just have a few brief questions, Minister, because we've already approved and ratified the Multilateral Convention, and as you said in your opening statement, it was included in the Finance Act last year. Can I just ask why, in the case of the Netherlands, is it a replacement DTA, whereas in the case of Switzerland, it is a protocol? Both seem to be to achieve the same objective of giving recognition to the Multilateral Convention. You make reference to particular issues in the Swiss system, but perhaps you might address that point.
It's because our negotiations with the Netherlands were so well advanced before the OECD work concluded. It was felt that it would be prompter now to conclude the agreement by way of ratifying the OECD changes into an agreement, whereas the work with the Swiss authorities took place after that, and therefore we feel the best way to do that is via a protocol.
Okay, so it's a timing issue,
yep.
Really. And do I take it that in the majority of double taxation agreements, they were updated automatically as a result of the ratification of the Multilateral Convention, but these particular ones weren't? And similarly, you flagged that the DTA with Germany will need to be updated in due course. So why is it that most were updated automatically, but others were not? A small number were not.
So the answer to the three questions you put to me is yes, in terms of the three particular points that you put to me. and then it is the request of Germany in the negotiations that we're having with them that we conclude this work with them bilaterally and then make the changes via what we're doing with the Dutch model. So we will include the changes of it in the treaty as opposed to via a multilateral convention.
Okay. And just two further questions, Chair. Apart from giving effect to the multilateral convention, are there other changes being given effect to here through the new DTA or the new protocol? Because we've already dealt with the multilateral convention in relation to BEPS. So are there other changes as a result of this that should be highlighted and brought to the attention of the committee?
So the only other changes that should be highlighted is the new double tax agreement now encompasses modern OECD provisions as well as reflecting in particular Irish or Dutch measures that were agreed bilaterally. The new double tax agreement is also fully compliant with the minimum standards under the OECD base erosion project, as well as incorporating a number of other measures recommended under the BEPS project and agreed bilaterally between Ireland and the Netherlands. And if the Deputy would be okay with us, if there are, here we go, these are the particular matters. The updates that are included include provisions in relation to the adjustment of profits of associated companies, more extensive exchange of information provisions, and a separate provision on the assistance in the collection of taxes.
Thank you, Chair.
Deputy Burton.
Thank you. First of all, I'm glad that the country is proceeding, however slowly, with signing up more and more to the BEPS process. And what I'd just like to ask in relation to the Netherlands has long been known to, for instance, tax areas like copyright earnings from music and from other copyright earnings at far more favourable basis to taxpayers like music groups who might have very significant earnings from royalties. I think there's a well-known Irish case published in many years in relation to U2 transferring quite an amount of their activities to the Netherlands jurisdiction because the tax situation was favourable there. Now, what I just want to ask you is, in the context of this agreement, has that situation been mitigated? Is it still advantageous for the likes of U2 to use the Netherlands extensively? And the second question I want to ask you is a general one in relation to countries which have avoidance mechanisms or may have avoidance or reduction mechanisms built into their systems to attract investment or whatever. There was a great deal of material published online via WikiLeaks and so on, which disclosed in relation to quite a number of individuals in different countries, whether we're talking about the general WikiLeaks or talking about the Panama Papers and so on, published by an international consortium of journalists, that there was significant international tax avoidance going on by very wealthy individuals, by banks and so on. Now, I would just like to know what to date has the Irish Revenue done to actually look at the situation in relation to persons or corporations of significant wealth who may have been identified or related to some of these information dumps in relation to tax avoidance. And my final comment would be, in relation to Ireland versus Switzerland, Ireland versus Netherlands, comparing and contrasting the tax situations, I mean, how at this point in time do you have a view of how our structures compare with their structures? Because obviously there's a great deal of competition for international investment and so on, but I think most people in the world, including in Ireland, want to see corporations and very wealthy individuals paying their fair share of tax. But I mean, I don't think that is happening in a complete way yet. And again, I'd like to know what's happening in terms of cooperation between tax authorities in the different jurisdictions. A lot of the BEPS process is the publication and sharing of information and data. Perhaps you could share with us what broadly has happened in this field that may mean that the very wealthy individuals and corporations don't have quite the same arrangements available to them to cancel their tax payments entirely. I think we saw one case being mentioned quite prominently in the papers today. That was to do with arrangements largely to do with Luxembourg, and we're not talking about Luxembourg today, where effectively by offshoring property assets and other assets off Ireland, they could reduce their tax bill very, very significantly, particularly corporate tax bills. I don't know about personal tax liabilities, but there was a lot of worrying information that came through in the disclosures about tax avoidance, and I'd like to know what has the Irish Revenue done, what has the Department of Finance done to stop the Irish taxpayer being taken for a ride.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Just in relation to the different matters that you've raised with me there. First, I'm not going to comment on, and you'll appreciate why not, the affairs of any particular taxpayer or any of the commentary in relation to them. You asked me, would the ratification of this treaty change the tax laws in relation to copyright or any earnings from music? I don't believe that they will, though I don't have in front of me information in relation to how the Netherlands tax, for example, copyright or income that comes from music. To deal with your point, though, regarding how this treaty and the ratification of us would deal with some of the issues that you've referred to, I believe a lot of the answer of that is contained in Article 22 of the treaty, which is also referenced in the protocol for Switzerland. And in Article 22, we're introducing what's referred to as a principal purpose test, a PPT. And the way this will operate is that it will deny treaty benefits to taxpayers when one of the principal purposes of any arrangement or transaction carried out by the taxpayer is to obtain a treaty benefit, unless it is established that granting the benefit would be in accordance with the provisions of the DTA. So what this is looking to do is give more power to tax authorities to ensure that the interaction and engagement between different tax jurisdictions isn't creating the opportunity for highly aggressive tax planning, or some of the issues that you've touched on. In relation to what the Revenue Commissioner have done in relation to this issue, as you're aware, the Revenue Investigations Division have reviewed the material that has come from the various leaks that have been that you've referred to, and the information that's come into the public domain, and any resource or any additional power that the Investigations Division of the Commission needs in order to pursue this work, I'm always willing to make available to them, because I know how important it is. In terms of what do I believe is changing in relation to dealing with the issues that you're referring to, I think there's two big changes afoot, Deputy, but we're only in the early part of them happening. The first change is now the exchange of information between different tax authorities that is now enabled by more and more countries' ratification of the OECD Convention. I believe will be a very big development in ensuring that taxpayers meet the commitments that they have in different countries. In terms of additional revenue that has brought into us, it's early to put a figure on that, but I am confident that over time that change will make a big difference to some of the issues that you're referring to. And I believe the other thing that will accompany that is the guilty provision that was brought in under President Trump's corporate tax reforms, and the requirement that they have now brought in for American companies to have a minimum tax rate of 13.125%. If you combine that change with the works of the BEPS process, I believe you're going to see a very considerable change across the coming period in the ability for tax commitments to be evaded and a consequent increase in tax revenue to different jurisdictions across the world.
Yes, sir. Deputy Murphy.
Thanks a lot, and thanks, Minister. Just to start with a general question, first of all, a concern that tax justice activists and academics often have when it comes to double taxation agreements is that they often don't function to avoid double taxation, but instead function in effect to enable double non-taxation for corporations to avoid paying tax here, for example, when they would have to, but also avoid paying tax in another country because in that country they don't tax that particular activity in that way or whatever. Do you agree that in a general sense that is a danger with double taxation agreements?
Yeah. So I do not believe that the use of double taxation agreements in the past was one of the key reasons why the behaviour that you're referring to happened. But why this agreement is now important is in terms of how we will deal with this kind of issue in the future. And I would draw your attention, Deputy, to a number of particular elements of the treaty, of the agreement, I should say, that I believe will be important for how we deal with this issue in the future. The first one, the preamble. The preamble is now different to the texts that you would have seen in the past, where it's very clear that not only is its purpose to eliminate the risk of double taxation, it's also clear that it doesn't want to create opportunities for non-taxation or reduced taxation through tax evasion or avoidance, including through treaty shopping arrangements. And that preamble, as I mentioned in my introduction, was the text that the Revenue Commissioner then used in dealing with some issues that were identified with the use of the so-called and alleged single malt. Article number 1 in relation to how hybrids will be treated, and then Article number 22 in relation to the principal purpose test. I believe those two articles are going to make an important and positive difference to ensuring that global companies pay a fair level of taxation and that this is more transparent.
And do you think that there was a problem or potential flaws or loopholes or whatever in the kind of generation of double taxation agreements that were signed, say, in the late 60s and early 70s? So Switzerland was 1966, the Netherlands was 1969. You're attempting to rectify some of those issues potentially here, but does that mean that there are similar issues present in other double taxation agreements with other countries?
So, do I believe that there are other issues in other treaties? The way I would describe it is that there are better standards that all the treaties need to implement. And if we don't do it bilaterally, we're doing two countries here bilaterally, we'll be doing Germany bilaterally. The ratification of the multilateral instrument will bring everybody up into line. Do I believe these treaties in the past were the cause of the problem? I don't believe they were. I believe that the bigger issue was the mismatch between different national tax jurisdictions and the opportunities that therefore created for arrangements and for actions to be taken that facilitated highly aggressive tax planning. And I believe that part of the way in which we will now respond back to that is by, number one, doing as we did through using these agreements to deal with the difficulties that arose in relation to the so-called single malt. And then number two, ensuring then that all of our treaties with all countries, either bilaterally or through the multilateral convention, meet higher standards. And that's what I'm looking to do.
But the mismatch you refer to is only operable in the sense of where you have a double taxation agreement. That's what enables the mismatch to be abused, or similar agreements. You might come back on that. Just to move on to a specific, I appreciate you won't comment on the specific case, but you might comment on the country. So obviously, as Deputy Burton referred to in the papers today, is the Goodman Group making a profit of 170 million last year reportedly and paying effectively zero taxes through filing accounts in Luxembourg. The double taxation agreement that appears to be still operative with Luxembourg is from 1972, so it was written or was agreed just a couple of years after the one with the Netherlands. Is that an agreement that you are looking at revising or adjusting, or think that certainly from this vantage point it would seem to be a problem if someone can make, or a corporation can make such amount of profits and may be enabled to pay effectively zero tax on it?
So, as I said in relation to another question earlier on, I'm not going to comment on the tax affairs of any particular company or individual, but in answer to your other question in relation to our DTA between Ireland and Luxembourg, we will be updating that via use of the multilateral convention.
Okay, last couple of questions. I think it's interesting that, say, if we're dealing with 4 countries here, Luxembourg, Ireland, Netherlands and Switzerland, there are 4 countries that are in the top 7 of what Oxfam described as, it did a list of tax havens, corporate tax havens. I think Luxembourg was 7, Ireland was 6, and the Netherlands and Switzerland were above that. The Netherlands is 3rd and Switzerland is 4th. We've talked on a number of occasions about whether Ireland is or isn't a tax haven. Obviously, you don't think it is, so we won't necessarily pursue that ground now. But would you agree that the Netherlands is a tax haven? A couple of examples. It uses an innovation box, which is similar to our own knowledge box, which costs the state about 1.2 billion annually. 7.6% of the country's total income from corporation tax. It facilitates so-called mailbox companies, with 12,000 companies channeling 4 trillion annually through the Netherlands. It doesn't tax extensively incoming dividends and royalties. It's a record of negotiating special tax agreements with multinationals, which obviously Ireland does too. Do you agree that Netherlands is a tax haven?
No, I don't. And in my engagement that I've had with the Dutch finance minister, I've seen him speak about these issues as well. He is a finance minister for a small, open economy like my own, like our own, I should say. And he is also very familiar with the need for domestic tax law and corporate tax policy to meet new and different standards. And he's involved in this work through the OECD, just like Ireland is.
Sounds like he probably gives a similar kind of speech to which the government in Ireland gives a speech about saying that this should happen internationally and so on. We move on to Switzerland. Would you agree that Switzerland is a corporate tax haven? 30% of Fortune 500 companies have operations in Switzerland. It's obviously, relatively speaking, a small company. One can presume that they are present to avail of very favourable tax situations. There have been, again, similar sweetheart deals in Switzerland with particular multinationals, and again, like the latest model of tax avoidance in Ireland, the role of patent boxes and knowledge boxes to facilitate extensive use of corporations getting away with paying extremely low rates of taxation.
It's not a description of Switzerland that I would share or use, and the other feature that all those economies have, as I said a moment ago to you, is they're all small economies. And I don't believe that competitiveness and the use of tax policy is something that is just a prerogative of large and big countries. But I also accept, as I've argued in this committee on a number of occasions, that whether you're a big or a small economy, you need to adjust your policy now to meet new international standards and respond back to issues that are being raised here at home and abroad. And in the debates that you and I have had on this matter, also, Deputy, I'd make the point that at times I don't believe enough recognition is given to Ireland for the change that they have made and that I and Minister Noonan have made in responding back to these kinds of issues, whether it be through the work of the OECD or changes we've made ourselves. And I'm sure if the finance ministers of those other countries were here in front of you, they'd make a similar point in terms of the change that they have made. And for example, if the Swiss finance minister was in front of you this afternoon, I'm sure he would be drawing attention to the fact, which I'm going to do now, that the Swiss authorities are now automatically providing very significant amounts of information to other tax authorities in relation to the use of bank accounts within their jurisdiction, to allow progress to be made on how taxes are levied fairly to either big companies or individuals. And I believe the progress that has been made in recent years on this issue does not get the recognition that it merits, but we need to continue making that progress.
Do you think you have to be a tropical island to be a corporate tax haven? Are there any European countries that you accept are tax havens, or is that a necessary condition that you're a tropical island?
Well, Deputy, I think you're about to take me on a tour of the world in terms of working through individual countries. So I'll just refer back to what, for example, the Commission would say and what Commissioner Moscovici would say, in that he would make the case that no countries within the European Union meet the global criteria of what a tax haven is seen to be.
Thanks.
Deputy Doherty.
Can I ask to start off with, in relation to the two proposals before us, in relation to Netherlands, it is the replacement of an existing agreement, and in relation to Switzerland, it is a protocol, which is what some of we've done in other areas. Like 4 or 5 years ago in Denmark, we added a protocol to Denmark and also to Luxembourg. So can you talk to us about the distinction why we have a replacement of an agreement in one and an addition of a protocol in others?
So if I deal with Switzerland mainly, I can talk about the Netherlands as well, and neither side has identified the need to renegotiate the double tax agreement. While the existing treaty with Switzerland is one of Ireland's oldest, the protocol to it, signed in 2012, implemented key provisions in respect of OECD standards, and furthermore it made important amendments to reflect changes in our respective laws. So given that the treaty had most recently been updated via a protocol, it was judged that the most expedient way to do the work again was via a further protocol as opposed to a new double tax agreement, and that's not the case with the Netherlands. It was decided that the best course of action was a new agreement with them overall. We haven't had the same kind of protocol change that we've had with the Swiss.
Okay. What other agreements or protocols are coming down the track?
So if I look at the work that is currently underway, the work breaches out into 3 different areas. So in terms of further change that's due to happen, the next significant bilateral change will be the work that we have underway with Germany. The vast majority of the rest of the change, if not all of it, will be made via the multilateral convention as opposed to going treaty by treaty. And in relation to new treaties with other countries, our focus, where necessary or where needed, will now be in Latin America, Africa and the Far East.
Okay. So the last time we updated the double taxation agreement with Luxembourg was it 2014?
2012, Deputy.
2012. And there's no plans at this point in time?
That will be done via the multilateral convention as opposed to a further bilateral treaty. And
can I ask you, you say, that the primary change in the agreement is the anti-avoidance issues. In particular, the new double taxation agreement includes the principal purpose test, which is under BEPS, under Action 6. And you go on to state that the test ensures that any benefits under the double taxation agreement are denied if the main purpose of the arrangement is the avoidance of tax. Maybe the first question is are you happy that that test is present in existing double taxation agreements, and in particular with reference to the agreement we have with Luxembourg?
So this is a new change that has been developed via the OECD work, which leads me on to answering your question. Am I happy that the pre-OECD work had the strongest check in place? I feel this change is needed, and it's going to be a big improvement.
So this change is needed. It'll be a big improvement to these two taxation agreements, but does it exist in the Luxembourg agreement?
Bear with me for one moment. Yeah, so it will come in when ratified through the multilateral convention. So it's not there at the moment. It will take place through the broad OECD change.
And when's that likely to take place?
It will be in effect for us from November.
November this year.
November this year.
So we have GAR, we have the General Anti-Avoidance Rule, which is in our statute book for many, many years, has been updated in different finance acts. And that rule is very, very clear that where an arrangement is primary, or the main purpose of it is for avoidance of tax, then the benefits will not accrue. Am I wrong in that, or is that correct?
That is correct, but by the benefit of the OECD work is an equivalent to that now has to be implemented in any other jurisdiction that is participating in the work. So while we may have strong recognition of this in our existing tax law, the benefit of the OECD approach is that it encourages, in inverted commas, everybody else to do the same.
So if, for example, a business was to change its residency from Ireland to, let's say, Luxembourg, and benefited, the main purpose of this here was for tax avoidance, then that, under our existing law, under the General Anti-Avoidance Rule, that would be deemed as tax evasion because it would be illegal under our law, and therefore the benefits wouldn't apply. Would that be correct?
Well, that is the purpose of a change like this, but I know that,
No, I'm not asking about a change like this. I'm asking about our existing law, because this doesn't apply to all other agreements. So the General Anti-Avoidance Rule, if a company were to transfer or to change its residency from here to another jurisdiction, for example, Luxembourg, which then benefited, which the main purpose of it was for tax purposes, then obviously they would not benefit from.
So what I might do, actually, if the Deputy, if you're okay with this, if it's a particularly technical question you're asking me, I might ask Mr. O'Dea here to answer directly for you.
Okay.
If that's
Thank
okay
you.
with you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy, I think the distinction here would be that for the purposes of the treaty, the multilateral convention is necessary to put in the principal purposes test, which will then govern the operation of the treaty in determining where a company is deemed to be resident, whether it's resident in Ireland or in the treaty partner country. However, as you correctly point out, we also have our general anti-avoidance provision in our domestic legislation, and to the extent that there was any effort through artificial arrangements to get a benefit in respect of Irish tax, corporation tax or income tax by reference to residence provisions of Irish law, that will be governed by our general anti-avoidance provisions as well as the residence provisions in our domestic law. So to the extent that the residence is for the purpose of the operation of our domestic law, Deputy, that will be governed by Irish domestic provisions, including our general anti-avoidance provision. But where it comes to the determination of the residence of a company for the purposes of a bilateral agreement, the governing provisions would be bilateral provisions, and the multilateral convention, which Luxembourg is ratifying as well as ourselves, will make provision for a principal purpose test to apply in the application of that treaty. So if that treaty were to be used in a way that was deemed to be wholly to artificially gain the benefits of the treaty for the purposes of reducing tax, it would be possible to limit and to prevent and to challenge those purposes.
But in the absence and until that is signed, it is our law that would apply, so therefore they would not be able to get the benefit. So if a company, for example, transferred assets to another jurisdiction and then supplied loans into this country that allowed them to write down their profits, but that transfer arrangement was done to reduce their tax liability to zero or next to zero, our current law under the general anti-avoidance rule could nullify that if the principal aim of that arrangement was for tax purposes, without any treaty or without any bilateral.
I wouldn't wish to give the impression that our domestic provisions wouldn't have effect. They would have effect, but if any planning arrangement of the sort that you're mentioning, Deputy, were relying on a protection of the treaty, it would have to be an anti-avoidance provision put into the treaty that would prevent that. So if a taxpayer appeals to the provisions of a treaty, they can rely on a bilateral agreement to effectively override domestic law on either side. But what we are engaged in at the moment and what's happening on a multilateral basis is that across our whole network of treaties, and in some exceptional instances bilaterally, we're putting in anti-avoidance provisions being the principal purpose test, which prevent the treaty being used simply to gain a tax benefit without any underlying substance. So if the particular arrangement that you're referring to were relying on a treaty provision for protection, that is being addressed now with the multilateral convention, with the bilateral negotiations. But in many instances, they will not actually, such arrangements won't be relying on the treaty, and they can be attacked using a considerable range of domestic anti-avoidance legislation that has been strengthened over recent years.
Doherty, we have a half hour left in this meeting, and we had agreed that we would go to the credit union issue. Okay. To finish at 3:15, because the minister's only with us.
Okay, I'll be very quick in relation to the rest. So there's a nuance there in relation to our existing law, and a couple of questions. When this agreement is signed with and ratified with Denmark and Luxembourg, but also with the Netherlands and Switzerland, but when it's also signed by the others, Luxembourg, later on in this year, will it then look at the permanent establishment of existing companies, or will it just apply to new establishments that are, new residencies, changes in residencies that are being applied after that date? That's the first question. In relation to the changes that we did in the Finance Bill last year, which was the transfer of assets from a PE to another subsidiary of the company, we introduced measures which would tax those assets that were transferred from the parent company or from one part of the company to the other if they were moved offshore. Does any of these arrangements impact on that? And then thirdly, and the last question is, and they have mentioned, it's been mentioned before in relation to the case that's in the papers, and that's why some of my teasing out of these issues is taking place. But is there anything in these double taxation agreements that allows or disallows for companies, whoever they are, to carry on this type of practice, which, assets are signed over to another country, and then loans are sent back to Ireland to build apartment blocks or whatever it is here, and therefore these companies in Ireland pay no profits whatsoever, and we have revenue silent on it, and there's no questions. We have anti-avoidance taxes. I got a call from somebody, a local shopkeeper employing a lot of people in a certain village, and revenue were down to them like a ton of bricks. You know why? Because for the local church, they were facilitating the sale of mass cards that the shop wasn't benefiting from at all. Because revenue says that it could possibly increase your throughput into the shop, because somebody might be coming in for a mass card and might get a loaf of bread, then they came down on them with a ton of bricks. Yet we see these type of arrangements that aren't about the €5 for somebody who's passed away and to show your sympathies and respects, but hundreds of millions of euros in convoluted schemes that allow for assets to be transferred offshore, loans then to be generated on the back of those assets to allow for profits to be completely neutralised here. And these major, some of the largest businesses on this island not paying their fair share of tax, if indeed any tax. So my question is, will those practices still be allowed under this agreement and indeed the agreement that will be signed in November of this year? Thank you.
So in relation to your first question, this will apply to existing companies as opposed to companies that are due to be set up. In relation to your second question regarding does this make any have any impact on changes that we made in last year's finance bill, the answer to that question is no. And then thirdly, in relation to the question that you've put there regarding the issue that is covered in a newspaper today, again, I'm going to, as you'll understand, and indeed as you haven't done it either, Deputy, I'm not going to comment on this individual company. It wouldn't be appropriate. But in my experience of dealing with the Revenue Commissioner, they take people evading their legal tax responsibilities. They take that issue every bit as seriously if you are a large company as if you are a small one. And they are exceptionally serious about ensuring they enforce existing law and policy to deal with that kind of issue.
So, and my final question is here, which is an answer to the first one. So a company who's established, and we see this in the papers today, a company who's established with no employees whatsoever, but is providing loans to a company in Ireland where their parent company is, and it facilitates them to write down their tax, that will be deemed as permanently established in another jurisdiction despite the fact that they have no operation there, no employees there. Like, how can you run a company without any employees? None. The 4 companies have no employees, but this rule will say whatever was done in the past, we'll turn a blind eye to it, and it's only for companies that are established in the future, no matter how blatant it is that this was for tax purposes in the first place.
But no, the changes that I'm referring to will refer to existing companies as opposed to those that are going to be set up, which is what I aimed to say there a few moments ago. And the ratification of the OECD changes will make it significantly harder for tax avoidance to happen in the way that it has in the past. But if I go any further than that, my comments are going to be associated with the company that has been discussed today, which wouldn't be appropriate to do.
Minister, we're moving on now to the credit union.
The Minister didn't answer my question. I asked the Minister about the amount of information that had become available in recent years through a variety of sources which indicated that there were people in Ireland who were avoiding paying their fair share of tax either through personal structures or company structures. We have a very detailed article on page 15 of today's Irish Times from Colm Keena, who's a very reputable journalist, who is indicating complex tax arrangements concerning companies and the establishment of what I can only describe as brass plate companies in Luxembourg in particular, but reflecting on 4 or 5 other jurisdictions because these are complex arrangements. And what I was asking you, Minister, and I want to repeat again, firstly, is it of concern for you? At the moment, beef farmers in Ireland are entering into, I think, a very, very difficult period.
I'm giving you leeway here, so I just put the question,
they're entering into a very difficult period. We have a very elaborate, complex description in one of our major newspapers today by a very reputable journalist indicating a complex tax arrangement which appears to have resulted in the mitigation of this company's overall tax burden, certainly in Ireland, being mitigated to a very, very high degree. I want to know, firstly, is the Minister concerned about that? As I said, the beef producers in Ireland
that, Deputy
are
Burke. Ask the
entering
question.
into a very difficult phase. The second thing I want to ask, and I asked the Minister before, he didn't reference it, I asked him what were the revenue commissioners doing about high net worth individuals. I'm open to whatever kind of structure they have, whether it's income or whether it's company structures or it's trading businesses. But the revenue commissioners came in and told us and various other committees, including I think the PAC, for the last couple of years, that they were targeting, if memory serves me right, around 350 so-called high net worth individuals. I'm asking you, in the context, this is all about properly advancing structures.
You've asked a question.
Can I? Well, the
Minister,
Minister didn't answer, so I'm just maybe explaining at slightly greater length.
If you would give the answer directly, Minister, and then we'll conclude on that, and we're moving to the credit union issue.
Thank you, Chairman. Deputy, you're referring to a particular company that is covered off in a major newspaper today, and I can understand entirely why you want to raise the issue, given some of the issues that are raised by the newspaper today. It's simply not appropriate for me to comment on it. Any comments I make will be interpreted as applying to the affairs of a taxpayer, and that is not something I believe is appropriate for me to do as Minister for Finance. The Revenue Commissioner, as you know, and they've been in front of this committee on many occasions, rigorously follow up any issues in relation to a breach of tax law. And I am not going to make a comment that could be interpreted as applying to any individual or company. I don't believe that would be appropriate. In relation to the work that the Revenue Commissioner have done in relation to high net worth individuals, I'm happy to supply back to the committee a note regarding recent progress that they have made in this area, particularly across 2019. But I know, for example, and I thought I did answer when you raised the issue with me earlier on, that some of the issues that have emerged from some of the data that emerged into the public domain that are relevant to Ireland, those issues have been investigated and have been followed up by the Revenue Commissioner, and that has happened.
Okay. I now propose that the clerk should send a message to the effect to the clerk of the Dáil, in accordance with Standing Order 90 and 80 line 2, that we have considered these matters. Is that agreed? Agreed. Now move on, Minister, to the credit union issue. I understand you have some opening comments, if you want to briefly go through them.
Thank you, Committee. Thank you, Chairman, for inviting me to discuss this important matter. First, I think it's important to recognise that credit unions, as volunteer-run financial cooperatives, provide an invaluable service to both rural and urban areas in Ireland. As Minister for Finance, I'm keen to continue to support this sector, and this is reflected in the regular engagement I have had with it. In February, I invited a number of credit union stakeholders to an engagement session in the Department, and it's my intention to continue this active engagement with credit union representatives, and I hope to hold more of these sessions in the future. In terms of regulation, as you will be aware, credit unions are regulated and supervised by the Registrar of Credit Unions at the Central Bank, who is the important regulator for credit unions. Within his independent regulatory discretion, the Registrar acts to support the prudential soundness of individual credit unions, to maintain sector stability and to protect the savings of credit union members. Section 32D of the Central Bank Act of 1942, as amended, provides that the Central Bank of Ireland may, with the approval of the Minister for Finance, make regulations prescribing an annual industry funding levy to be paid by regulated financial service providers to the Central Bank of Ireland. The industry funding levy is not specific to credit unions, and there is no statutory requirement under the legislation for the Central Bank to consult the Credit Union Advisory Committee or any third party other than the Minister for Finance. However, it's worth noting that the final report of the CUOC Implementation Group, published in January 2019, makes specific reference to the Central Bank's intention to increase the industry funding levy for credit unions to 50% on a phased basis. Since 2004, the amount of the industry funding levy payable by each credit union has been capped at a rate of 0.01%. Consultation Paper 95, which was entitled the Department of Finance and Central Bank of Ireland regarding the funding of the cost of financial regulation, was published in 2015. It set out proposals to move from partial industry funding to full industry funding. In noting the proposals set out in an earlier consultation conducted by the Central Bank, which was entitled Consultation on Impact-Based Levies and Other Levy-Related Matters. So this was to move credit unions to fund 50% of the cost of regulating the credit union sector. Importantly, the Central Bank's feedback statement on consultation process for CP61 noted the feedback received from the credit union representative bodies. In its funding strategy and 2018 guide to the industry funding levy, the Central Bank set out its intention to increase the proportion of financial regulation costs for industry, to increase the overall recovery rate and address funding gaps in specific areas of the Central Bank's regulatory activities, with a view to achieving full industry funding in the medium term. In terms of credit unions, the Central Bank set out an initial target of 50% to be implemented on a phased basis by 2021 to 2022. Having taken into consideration the unique and important role that credit unions play, I recommend to the Central Bank that credit unions be provided with a specific exemption from the 100% target, the only part of the financial services sector to have this exemption. Instead, credit unions will be set a target of 50% by 2021 to 2022. It's projected that this will be recovered from credit unions on a phased basis, with recovery rates to increase to 20% of the costs of regulating the credit union sector for the 2019 levy, moving to 35% for 2020 and 50% for 2021. Credit union recovery rates from 22 onwards will be subject to review, and a public consultation to guide strategy once 50% recovery rates have been achieved. In contrast, the banks have been subject to 100% of financial regulation costs in 2012. The committee members may also be interested to note that the Department of Finance, in collaboration with the Central Bank, has now issued a public consultation paper on potential changes to the credit institutions regulation fund levy, which is expected to reduce materially from 2020. This paper is open for consultation. The deadline is Friday, the 9th of August. Thank you, Chairman, for the opportunity to be here, and look forward to responding back to any points.
Clarify, Minister, you say in February of this year invited a number of credit union stakeholders to an engagement session. Was that engagement session about the funding levy, or was it just general engagement?
It was just general engagement.
Okay. Right, Deputy McGrath.
Yeah, I think there's another page to your statement if you want to read it, Minister. But
the version of it I had left out a concluding page, so I might just go on to my concluding page. Once the deadline for submissions has closed, the Department, in collaboration with the Central Bank, will consider the feedback received as part of the consultation process. It's worth noting that as Minister for Finance, I have reduced the Stabilisation Scheme levy as a percentage of assets materially, that since 2017 no further levies have been charged, and that from 2019 the Financial Services Ombudsman levy will be reduced materially for credit unions, in some cases by 81%. I recognise strongly the role of our credit unions. I recognise, for example, the €2 billion worth of new lending that they make available and have made available every year. In the work that we are doing with the credit union movement, and the general work that I'm doing in relation to levies that the sector is dealing with. I'm conscious of the issues that they face, and will look to respond back to different issues that they've raised with me over time.
Okay. Deputy McGrath.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Minister, thank you for agreeing to take this issue today. I raised it at the committee here last week and suggested that you be given notice that we intended to use this opportunity to raise this issue, and also to acknowledge the agreement of the senators who are not members of the Select Committee, allowing us as deputies to raise this issue with you today. If I can just have an exchange with you for a few moments, Minister. Just on the question of consultation, you said that the CUAC committee, the Credit Union Advisory Committee, in their implementation group report published in January 19 made specific reference to this increase in the levy. But can I ask, did you as Minister directly seek the advice of CUAC on this issue before signing off on the Central Bank's proposal?
No, I didn't, Chairman, and I'm not required to seek their input either. I consulted with my own officials and looked at the recommendation that was made to me from the Central Bank.
Also, can I ask you, the Taoiseach in the Dáil on the 20th of June, when this was raised with him, he said at the time that there was consultation with the credit union movement, which was more than aware of the proposed changes, and he went on to say, and was involved in seeking them in most cases. That strikes me as being wholly inaccurate. There wasn't any direct consultation with the sector, and they certainly didn't seek this change.
No, I'm glad to have the opportunity to clear that matter up. What the Taoiseach was referring to there was he was referring to the changes that we have made, or I'm looking to make, in relation to the interest rate cap for lending from the credit union movement. And when the issue was raised with him, he assumed it was referring to the interest rate change, and in fact the deputy who was raising the issue with them was referring to the levy.
Okay, well, he may wish to correct the record of the Dáil on that, because the question he was asked was very directly about the annual industry funding levy. It seems pretty clear from reading the transcript. Minister, as you well know, credit unions are under a lot of pressure because of the very low investment returns. The loan to deposit ratio is in the region of 27%, which is in the long term not at a sustainable level. I think you would probably agree with that. And the point that the representative bodies, including the League, who are represented here today, have made to us, and I'm sure to you, is that they really shouldn't be treated like banks, because they are not banks. They are not-for-profit organisations that they believe, and I agree with them, have not placed sufficient regard or value on the social capital, on the work of their volunteers, their community base, or indeed their democratic structure. Now, it's very evident from looking at the actual paper, the Central Bank paper, funding the cost of financial regulation, it is their intention to move to 100% beyond 2022, and they say credit union recovery rates from 2022 onwards will be subject to review and a public consultation to guide strategy once 50% recovery rates have been achieved. But they're very clear that that is their intention. So my question to you is, why did you not push back on the Central Bank and say, look, this is completely the wrong time to impose these extra costs on credit unions? You may argue that other levies are winding down, but the big one, the Credit Institutions Resolution Fund levy, is still at a very elevated level at about €7.5 million a year. And why did you not make these points to the Central Bank and seek to at least defer, or ideally make an actual separation in structural terms in the treatment of credit unions as opposed to for-profit financial institutions?
Well, the treatment between for-profit financial institutions and the credit unions is now very different due to these changes, because our banks, and correctly so, will have to cover the full 100% cost. For the credit unions, at its highest point, it will move up to 50%. It will be a matter for the Finance Minister of the day, regarding when this period comes to an end, regarding what should be the appropriate threshold for the next phase of this levy. But I'm very clear that the appropriate threshold should be and is lower than what our banks are paying at the moment at 100%. And I would urge that the committee sees this change in the light of what will be happening with total levies across 2020. So our judgment and our analysis, I should say, will indicate that across 2020 there will be a reduction in the levies that are due to be paid versus where we are in 2019. And while it is correct to say that the industry funding levy is going up, this will be taking place at a point in time in which the resolution levy will be coming significantly down. And as I mentioned in my introduction to the committee as well, there will then be an opportunity for the Minister for Finance in 2021 to review the future of the stabilisation levy. So I would argue and contend to you, Deputy, that in the round, if you have a look at all of the levies that the credit union movement are paying or are due to pay, there is an appreciation of the challenges and pressures that they face and of the value that they have for our economy and our society.
Yeah, just finally, Chair, I would just make the point to you, Minister, that the Resolution Fund currently holds €268 million, which is, as you know, is €18 million in excess of the amount that the Minister contributed back in 2017. That fund is currently costing credit unions €7.5 million per annum. So I think what you're saying to us today, in effect, is taking into account the changes that are likely to be made in relation to that levy, the Resolution Fund levy, that the net position for 2020 will be a reduction in the overall burden of levies the credit unions are carrying. You might clarify if that is what you're saying. I note that you have reiterated again the consultation phase in respect of the review of that levy, the Resolution Fund levy, and submissions can be made up to a date in August. But is that the direction of your thinking on that? Because really it's very questionable that credit unions should be required to continue to pay into that at all, given the level of funding that is already built up in that fund, and the rescues that had to be carried out across the sector have been essentially funded by the movement themselves to date.
So I am just seeking to place the change in the funding levy in the context of what will be happening in other levies that the credit union movement is due to pay. But my key point to you would be that in relation to the industry funding levy, I believe I have given recognition of the particular needs of the credit union movement by ensuring that they are paying 50% of the cost as opposed to all of the cost. And I believe that is a proportionate recognition by the government of the value of the credit union movement and some of the particular challenges that they are facing at the moment.
And just to clarify what you said earlier about the net position next year, are you saying that it will be a net reduction in terms of the liability of levies?
So for next year, our analysis indicates that there will be a reduction in the total levies that the credit union movement will be paying.
And with that, what about the following year, when of course the industry funding levy will increase further?
It will, but when we move into 2021, at that point the stabilisation levy will then be open for review.
So it will continue to be a net reduction?
Well, that depends on what the outcome is of the review of the stabilisation levy.
Thanks, Chair.
Okay, Deputy Burton.
Thank you. Yes, like other deputies, I have received quite a lot of information from the credit unions in relation to their concerns about the changes in the levy. And what I wanted to ask you about was, given that the credit union movement is very significantly worked by volunteers, admittedly, there are professional staff in credit union offices, but the overall management structure is very much volunteer basis. And secondly, that credit unions also offer very much community banking facilities on a community basis, not just for individuals in a local community, but also for organisations like voluntary and sports organisations within communities. I would ask you to have a look at this again until such time as there is a clearer pathway about what the impact will be. The material that we received, or that I received from the credit unions, indicated that they could be very severely affected. You're saying now, and if it's correct, it's very welcome, that in fact the impact may not be as negative as has been feared. Am I right in understanding that from you? Because at the end of the day, comparing credit unions to banks, it's pretty unfair to the credit unions, given their voluntary community nature, and also the fact that they are heavily constrained, as you're aware, Minister, in what they can actually invest in because of that particular community and voluntary nature. But on the other hand, they are absolutely vital financial infrastructure, particularly to the many communities where there is no longer a bank, and where in the future there may well be far less ATMs. So I think having a look at the role they play and the significance and importance of that role, but also, as I say, if you are now saying that given that other payments that the credit unions are making in terms of stabilisation and so on, that in fact will be mitigated, are you saying that you think that overall credit unions will pay less? Because I think if credit unions end up paying a lot more, and as the note there indicates, they are being compared like for like with banks, commercial banks, which I don't think is an entirely appropriate comparison. You know, I think, Minister, you need to give us more information. I don't know if your department has done an impact assessment of the likely changes in the levy, and if you have that set out, if you could supply that impact assessment to the committee, I think it would be helpful.
Minister.
Thank you, Chairman. So just to reiterate the key point again, that by the way in which we have approached this via putting in place a 50% recovery rate, this means that credit unions are treated starkly different, as should be the case, to the other bodies that you've referred to, Deputy. So precisely in recognition of the point that you have made in relation to the capital or funding difficulty needs that credit unions have other than difficulties, and then the nature of their organisations, that is why they're at a 50% recovery rate versus, for example, the banks are 100%, those involved in insurance are 100%, money lenders or Bureau de Changes will be in 2020 at 75%. So we are looking to treat the credit union movement in a very different way to other bodies that are regulated, in recognition of the points that you have made. In relation to your point regarding the impact of the industry funding levy, it would be fair to say and accurate to say that the increase in the funding levy is of course going to have an impact on credit unions, and I acknowledge that. Our analysis indicates that over a 3-year period, when it moves up to 50%, it will be just under 3% of the current overheads that a credit union may be dealing with. So it will have an impact. I wouldn't want to create the impression otherwise. But I would just ask that as the committee is evaluating the decision that I have made, that it does so in the light of recognising that there is a reduction in the resolution levy, notwithstanding the point that Deputy McGrath has made, there is still a reduction in that levy, and that the stabilisation levy will be up for review in 2021.
Deputy Doherty.
Yeah. Like, Minister, you'll be aware, because I've raised the issue of the credit unions with you and this levy in parliamentary questions, but You'll also be aware for a number of years that I've argued that there should be 100% recovery on the industry, and I'm glad that that's now taken place. But credit unions, and you mentioned in your opening statement that you recognise the unique nature of the credit unions, and it's important just to name that. What is the unique nature, and what stands out, and what's different from a credit union than a bank or a money lender or a fund, is that they're not for profit, that they're community run, that they're in many ways volunteer led. There's no big bonuses for your boards or anything like that there, and that's the core of it, that they are different from your high street bank. So yes, and rightly so, the cost of regulation of banks, funds, major insurance companies, money lenders, of course, should be paid by the industry themselves as opposed to the public purse. But we have, as a society, recognised that there are important roles to regulate, and that should be paid for the public purse, the regulator. So for charities, we don't ask charities to pay for the regulation. We pay as a state for the charity regulator. The Sports Council, which regulate sports, it is paid by the public purse, because it would be wrong to ask the local team to pay for that. And equally, while they're involved in lending money, the fact that they are not for profit, the fact that they are community run, the fact that they are volunteer led, distinguishes them from the rest of the sector. So outside of talking about the rates and all the rest, there's a question on why we are applying this additional burden, and why we are calculating and trying to put a figure on what is their nearly worth for society, as opposed to accepting that yes, they are unique, and that means that they're carved out. They're not a bank, they're not a money lender, they're not a fund, they're not an insurance company. They are a credit union which is locally run, responding to local needs, and which is key of all, they are not for profit.
I agree. This is why we are not doing 100. This is why I am not sitting in front of this committee with a proposal for 100% industry funding of the levy. I agree with the point you are making, Deputy, and I think all deputies all share your view that this is a sector that is uniquely different to other parts of the broad financial sector within our economy. But that is why we have a target of them being levied at half the rate to some of the sectors that you have compared them to. And I know there's a difference, which is why there is a difference in how the levy will be funded. I am recognising that in what I have done. The impending arrival of this change has been very well flagged. If it would be of help, I can go through how this has been flagged again. But this change was very well flagged to the sector, and in recognition of their nature, it is why they are moving to a 50% model and not a 100% model.
Well, there's two things. First of all, it's not 50% full stop. It's 50%, and now then we will have a consultation to see what happens after the 50%. There's no guarantee, unless you want to give that guarantee here now, that it is only 50%. Maybe if you could just give that guarantee first, and that could clear up some of my other questions.
Well, you know I can't,
Okay.
because I have,
Okay.
this is guided by recommendations that the central bank make.
Okay.
But it is a fair horizon within which to plan your affairs, that the credit union movement will know now where they stand across 2021 and 22. And this is after, as I said a moment ago, a lot of work had been done to flag that this change was due.
Yeah, but see, you agreeing with me, really you're not, because I'm arguing something different. What you're saying is, look, I agree with you, and that's why I've asked the central bank to phase in the increase. So all that's happening at the minute, it's happening at a slower rate. It's going to 50%, and then there's a consultation, and as you've just outlined, with no guarantee that it won't go up to 100%, just like the just like the Main Street banks. But outside of all of that, if this is a sector that stands on its own, that is regulated, yes, like the rest of the other industries by the central bank, should there not be? The question is why are we raising the levy to 50% in the first place? Like, we have been given figures, for example, the impact on a large credit union would mean that in a 4-year period, in a 4-year period, it would be an extra €115,000. So, if we really value the work that's been done by those boards, the volunteer nature, and we've placed a lot of additional responsibilities through legislation in terms of their skills base and so on and so forth, and qualifications and burdens on them. If we value them, if we value the nature of a not-for-profit entity that lends money, as opposed to the banks that are trying to suck the bloody blood out of you, like, if we value that community response, responding to community needs, why would we be placing additional? Why would we even be putting them in the same category as the other banks? Why don't we adopt the same principle that we adopt with the charities? Charities do good work for society, therefore, but they need to be regulated. But we're not going to ask the charities themselves to pay for the regulation.
There's a completely different, huge difference between the charity sector and any sector that is involved in the lending of money. That's the reason why. The regulatory needs that we have for organisations that are involved in providing billions of euro worth of credit into our economy every year are completely different to the needs that we have to regulate the charity sector. You made the point that the credit unions are in the same category or group as our banks. That's not the case. The contribution they are going to have to make to the funding of their regulation is, as I've said before, half of that of which the banks are doing. And it is a well-established principle across all of our economy that if we have sectors that need regulation, that those sectors make a contribution, mostly in full, to the regulators and to the cost of that regulation, whether it be the energy regulator, whether it be the pensions ombudsman. They're all fully funded by the industry within which they're in. And in this case, as I said before, we're recognising the difference of the credit union movement by a lower rate of contribution.
Prior to 2012, what did the high street banks pay in terms of the cost of regulation? 50%.
I don't have that information.
It was 50%. They paid 50% towards the cost of regulation. Now, just think about this here. 7 years ago, AIB, Bank of Ireland, and this is, you were in government during this period, and it was changed then, and it was scaled, it was phased in over a period of time to recover up to 100%. But 7 years ago, Bank of Ireland, AIB, Ulster Bank and all the rest, some of the banks that crashed this economy were paying 50% the cost of regulation. And now we're going to ask the local credit union, who's volunteer-led, who's responded to the needs of the community, who is not-for-profit, to pay the same amount, same percentage amount as Bank of Ireland. Like, that's... No, that's wrong. 7 years ago, yes.
That's right.
7 years ago.
Well,
yeah, that's what...
That bit is right.
And the problem is, Minister, you cannot sit there, as you refuse to do so, and give a guarantee that in 7 years' time they won't be paying the full 100%. But the point is that you're now putting credit unions in a trajectory. Those banks, even during the crash and right after the crash, were paying 50%. It was wrong. I always argued they should be paying 100%. But that's now what you're doing to credit unions. You're not really recognising the unique value, the unique nature and all the rest. And you can argue that you are by slowing the introduction and will do the consultation. But the credit unions will tell you, Central Bank didn't listen to the consultation, didn't listen to their feedback. The Central Bank says, we're going up to 50% of an industry levy. What's your view on it? But we're doing it. That's not proper consultation. Yeah, I have one more further question.
We're finished.
I take a very different view to the Deputy in relation to it. you said I'm refusing to give a guarantee to you. You know it's because I can't. That's the difference.
Can we not introduce it in the finance bill?
So you know that I can't.
Can you not introduce it in the finance bill?
No, you know that it's the role of the central bank,
not at all,
under the legislation that I referred to earlier on,
exactly,
to make a decision in relation to what is the right rate to
Minister,
and I accepted their recommendation.
Minister,
so
can
you were asking me, Deputy, allow me to finish. You're well able to make your point. I'm going to make mine back. You're asking me to give a guarantee into what I or a future Minister for Finance might do in a few years' time, while not acknowledging that the rate of industry funding that is in place now is significantly lower than the banks that you have just quoted to me. So what I think you should be doing is giving me recognition for the decision that I have made, as opposed to a decision that is not due to be made for a number of years.
Okay, so I'm supposed to give you recognition for a decision you have made, which is what, to cap it at 50% at the minute, but understand and not blame you for not being able to give a guarantee for a decision you can't make. So on one hand you can cap it at 50%, but on the other hand you have no role in this because of the central bank. The reality is, Minister, you have a role and you can take a role if you want. We can introduce this in the finance bill, that there is a cap in relation to the amount that the central bank could apply in terms of regulation of credit unions. Like, I know that, you know that, the Chair knows that, every other member in this committee knows that. So, of course you could give a guarantee if you so wished. But I want to move on to my final two questions, and you can respond to that, Ger. And I did recognise that there's a difference between 50 and 100%, so don't try and suggest that I didn't. The last two questions is this. You mentioned that we are likely to see reductions in relation to the Credit Institution Resolution Fund levy, but again, there's consultation ongoing in relation to that, so we haven't seen the outcome of that. Would it not be more appropriate to wait until that consultation is ended, unless you know the answer to that consultation, you know what it's going to be? Maybe you can share that with the committee. What is the reduction? Because maybe the credit unions would sleep easier tonight if they knew that that was significantly reduced. I know that they've been engaging with you. I think they wrote to you back in April and you haven't responded to them. That's the communication that we've got so far in relation to that. So that's the first question. The second question is, in your speech, or your opening statement, you also mentioned in relation to the legislation that you're bringing forward, the Credit Union Interest and Loans Bill 2019. You'll be mindful that legislation that I introduced, which is the Moneylenders Bill, which is to reduce the amount of APR that moneylenders can charge. Obviously, it's up at 187%, that some of them are licensed for at the minute, has already passed second stages before the committee. It was also signalled, because it's part of the same report, that the 2%, the increase from 1% to 2% should accompany it. Would it not be appropriate for that to be part, as I signalled in second stage, that that would be a committee amendment as opposed to introducing another piece of legislation to bring this forward? Thank you.
Okay, I didn't say that you didn't make recognition of the fact that the industry rate is half of which the banks will be paying. I'm contending that you didn't give sufficient recognition of it, which I'm entitled to assess, as you're allowed to assess what I'm doing in this issue. In relation to the consultation period that is due to take place in relation to the future of the stabilisation levy, these matters are best dealt with separately. We have to make a decision in relation to what is the future of each levy based on what is the right thing for each of them individually. But all I am saying is that if you assess them in the round, the levy contribution for next year is lower than this year. And then in relation to your final point to me, Deputy, just before I answer it, could I just clarify your point? Are you suggesting that it would be a committee stage amendment to the piece of legislation that I'm due to bring in to change that you're looking to make?
No, what the question I ask is, I introduced a bill which is brought forward in second stage, or which is past second stage before the committee has gone through scrutiny here. I think the committee will be writing to you in relation to this. You've now, during second stage, it was signalled that we would increase the levy from 1% to 2%, because which would be the appropriate thing to do. On one hand, you're trying to reduce the APR on moneylenders, but on the other hand, you want to make sure that credit unions are the vehicle and avenue for people who want access to that type of finance. But you've produced your own legislation. I assume that that is because you are opposed to the moneylender bill, as opposed to what is the proper vehicle, which is actually the bill that is now progressing to just table the amendment, as I signalled at second stage to it, which is a very simple amendment.
Sorry, I'm still unclear. So
okay, there's a piece of legislation.
No, I'm aware of all of that. Could I just double check? Are you proposing then that you would look to amend the legislation that I'm bringing forward in relation to the higher interest rate cap?
No, I've already signalled that in second stage that we were going to bring an amendment to my own legislation to increase the credit union cap from 1% to 2%. Which should, as we know from the University of Cork report, in relation to their support for reducing the APR on moneylenders, what they suggested that it should be done hand in hand with the increase on the cap for credit unions. My concern is that the government have now introduced their own bill, but only dealing with one aspect of it, which is the 1% to 2% for credit unions. And I think I'm reading into it. Obviously, it's using up Oireachtas' time, because now we have two pieces of legislation that could do the same thing. But also, I read into it maybe that it's because of the reluctance of government to actually deal with the high and extortionate APRs that are being charged by moneylenders out there.
Well, I believe that the piece of legislation that we're bringing forward with the cap is a better way of dealing with the issue within the credit union movement. I'll consider your question and give a considered answer back.
Thank you.
Now that I fully understand the point that you're making, as opposed to me responding now,
that's fair
I'll come
enough.
back to the Deputy with us.
All right, thank you very much, Minister. Thanks to your officials and members. The meeting is now adjourned until Thursday, 11th of July.